The approach burn put us on a collision course with the largest structure anyone had ever surveyed, and my job for the next 40 seconds was to confirm we should stay on it. I pressed my mask to the observation port and watched the mass readouts update on my handheld. Survey Object 11 Kepler filled the forward view, the Ark, as we'd been calling it for 3 months. A broken ring of alien construction arced across 15 degrees of visible sky, its inner surface crusted with frozen towers, canal networks, and what looked from this distance like forest canopy locked under vacuum ice. The outer ribs curved away in long structural members, peeling free where the ring's integrity had failed decades or centuries ago. Our transfer ship, the Harlan, weighed less than a rounding error against that mass. The burn Carl Jessup had just executed changed our velocity by single-digit meters per second. Even that modest correction would matter if my structural models were wrong about the docking site's load tolerance. I am a Xeno structural surveyor. Companies hire me to look at alien architecture from a safe distance, run the numbers, and tell them whether it's safe to send people inside. I had spent 3 months on the survey platform running remote gravitational scans of the Ark, modeling its rotational decay and mapping which sections were still pressurized and which had blown out into hard vacuum. My assessment, the document that made this mission exist, said the Ark was stable enough for short-duration EVA boarding with standard precautions. That report had my name on it. The 4 men preparing to enter that broken ring were here because I had signed off on it. Tom, confirm docksite loading for the new approach angle. That was Doug Lister, our mission commander, strapped into the acceleration frame behind Carl's pilot station. Doug ran contract recovery teams for Palisade Extraction, the company bankrolling the trip. Former military EVA, 2 decades of deep space salvage, a calm voice that carried procedural authority the way some men carry a sidearm. He trusted my structural calls because I had never put a team into a building that killed someone. I checked the updated mass distribution against my model. The docking site was a structural rib near a corridor breach on the Ark's outer surface, where hull plating had separated enough for us to clamp on and walk through. My model predicted the rib could handle the Harlan's mass, docking stress, and our combined body weight without shifting the local structure. The new approach angle put us 18 degrees off my original profile, changing the stress vectors at the clamp points. Loading is within tolerance, I said. Rib section reads about 12% above minimum. We're fine. We're thin, Paul Keegan said from the equipment bay. Paul was our EVA engineer, a wide, quiet man who maintained tether systems, cutting rigs, maneuvering packs, and every other piece of hardware that kept a human being alive inside alien vacuum. He had a professional distrust of any 12% margin. Thin is fine, Doug said. Carl, how's our window? Carl Jessup didn't look up from his console. Dock in 19 minutes. Total mission clock starts at clamp contact. Orbital geometry gives us approximately 9 hours before the rubble envelope collapses our return trajectory. After that, I can still get the Harlan out, but anyone not on board rides the Ark down. Down meant a decaying spiral into the gas giant the Ark orbited, then structural breakup as tidal forces pulled the ring apart over weeks. The Ark had been losing orbital energy for at least a century. My remote survey had confirmed the decay rate was accelerating. This was a deathbed visit. Ray Moffat, our materials geologist, floated up from the lower deck with his sample kit already harnessed across his chest. Youngest on the team by 10 years, a postdoc who'd studied xenolithic mineralogy under Hargrove at Michigan. He talked about alien construction materials the way some people talked about music. He pressed his face against the port beside mine and watched the Ark grow. Lord, he said quietly, the inner surface. Are those canals? Irrigation or transport, possibly both. We'll know when we get in. The company wants material samples above all else, Doug said, moving through final suit check. Structural alloy, biological specimens, tool compositions, anything with patent potential. Physical recovery validates the contract. Documentation alone gives Palisade a minimum discovery claim and a lawsuit with the insurers. We are inside for 4 hours maximum. Stay en route. Touch nothing without Tom confirming the local structural read. Clear? We confirmed. I turned back to the port and watched the arc resolve into finer detail. The inner surface was a frozen cityscape. Spires, platforms, what might have been plazas or market squares, all locked in the perpetual twilight of a habitat drum that had lost the rotation needed to throw convincing light against its own inner sky. Its beauty registered somewhere inside my professional judgment as the highest value survey target I had ever approached. 3 months of remote data had prepared me for the scale. The scale still won. Then we entered the rubble field, and the scale stopped mattering. The wreckage around the arc extended outward for several hundred kilometers in a diffuse halo. Structural fragments, hull plating, pieces of alien machinery, and objects I couldn't immediately classify, standard for a decaying megastructure. I'd accounted for it in my approach model. I had not accounted for the geometry of the damage. Every piece of rubble was cut clean. I pressed the handheld to the port and zoomed the optics. A section of hull plating tumbled past, roughly 6 meters across, its edges smooth and polished. The cut plane was precise beyond what my instruments could resolve at this range, which meant sub-micron at minimum. The next piece, an alien probe of some kind, cylindrical and trailing frozen cable, had been separated into 11 parallel discs drifting in loose formation, like coins spilled from a roll. The cuts were identical. Planar. Perfect. Carl, hold approach for 15 seconds. I need a reading on the rubble composition. Holding! I swept the field with the gravitometric scanner. The readings showed cold mass, inert materials, and a stable thermal profile. Whatever had cut this wreckage had done it precisely, then stopped. The rubble was old and geometrically impossible. Doug, look at the cut planes. Everything out here has been sliced along molecular boundaries. I'm seeing a consistent mechanism across different materials, metal alloy, stone composite, and what I think are biological remains. Doug moved to the port. I pointed out a cluster drifting about 200 meters off the starboard approach line. Stone-like shapes, angular and heavy-looking, frozen in slow rotation. Bodies. Alien bodies, or fragments of bodies, separated into layers thinner than paper and fanned out in the vacuum like anatomical illustrations pulled apart for study. Defensive system, Doug said. Something that applies force with sub-micron precision across multiple material types. I can't tell from here whether it's targeted or environmental. Paul's voice came from the bay. That's not decay. No, I said. Doug watched the layered bodies drift past. He processed fast, the way he always did. Intake, risk assessment, decision. Active emissions. None I can read from here. Then we tighten the approach profile. We bored through the breach, stay roped, minimize tool activation. Standard hostile architecture protocol until we understand the cutting mechanism. Tom, you're on continuous structural scan once we're inside. Understood. Carl, resume approach. We crossed the remaining distance in silence. The rubble thinned as we neared the ark's surface, and Carl threaded the Harlan through a computed corridor that avoided the densest wreckage arcs. The docking procedure was manual and physical. Carl matched the ark's residual rotation, killed relative velocity with a series of corrective burns that used more propellant than I liked, and brought the Harlan's forward clamps against the structural rib I'd designated. The clamps engaged. The hull groaned as mass settled. I checked my model. The rib held. Stress readings came in at 11% above minimum. Paul's expression said what he thought of 11%. We suited up in the equipment bay. 4 men in hardshell EVA rigs, tethered in pairs. Doug and Ray on the primary line, Paul and me on secondary. Helmet lamps charged, comms checked, maneuvering packs trimmed for the variable gravity I expected inside. I carried the gravitometric scanner on my chest harness, where I could read it without stopping. Ray carried his sample kit and a portable spectrometer. Paul carried the cutting rig and emergency sealant packs. Doug carried command authority and a calm voice. That division of labor had always been enough. The breach was 9 meters from the Harlan's forward airlock. We crossed in vacuum, boots magnetized to the rib surface, headlamps cutting the dark. I reached the breach first and swept my scanner through the opening. The corridor inside hung in pieces. Sections of wall, floor panel and conduit bundle had separated from one another along clean gravitational planes and drifted into offset positions. Each piece held its shape, displaced by centimeters or tens of centimeters from its neighbors. The effect was architectural, as if someone had taken a completed hallway and gently pulled its components apart into an exploded diagram. Through the gaps between layers, I could see more corridors, more separated structure, the geometry of displacement curving away in a long, graceful arc that followed the ring's curve. The separation isn't impact damage, I said over comms. The pattern is consistent with precisely applied gravitational shear. Something pulled these components apart with the same mechanism that cut the rubble outside. Is it active? Doug asked. I watched the scanner. The readings showed residual gravitational microfields, tiny, localized, layered through the corridor structure like geological strata. Weak, passive, old scars. Residual only, low intensity. I'm reading this as inactive damage, maintained by leftover charge. Define inactive. Active fields correct. Residual fields remember. Dead zones do nothing. Right now, this corridor is residual. Good enough to enter? I checked again. The numbers stayed low. My report had modeled gross structural failure, pressure pockets, decaying rotation, and docking stress. It had not modeled a building that remembered how to cut. Good enough, I said. Then we go in. Standard spacing. Tom on point with the scanner. The transit corridor ran inward from the breach towards the habitat drum, angling down through structural bulkheads spaced at regular intervals. Every bulkhead had been designed to seal against vacuum loss, and every one we passed stood open, its locking mechanisms intact but displaced by centimeters of clean offset. I scanned each one as we passed. The gravitational readings shifted with every bulkhead. Residual fields fluctuating across short distances, some zones pulling at roughly 1/4 G, others registering near zero, a few spiking in ways my scanner flagged but couldn't resolve. The variable gravity made walking strange. My boots gripped the floor in one section and slid free in the next. Ray, ahead of me on the primary tether, bounced off a wall when a brief gravitational null caught his stride and sent him drifting. Paul reeled him back by the line without comment. We reached the inner surface overlook after 40 minutes of careful transit. Doug called a halt at a structural gallery, a long, open platform facing inward across the habitat drum. The 4 of us stood at the rail and saw what the arc had been. The drum stretched away in both directions, curving upward toward a false horizon where the landscape met itself overhead. Cities covered the surface in dense blocks. Towers, low structures, open plazas, canal networks filled with vacuum ice, and vegetation frozen into dark crystalline masses. In places, the landscape was intact, with buildings standing upright, trees rooted in soil locked beneath the surface. The ghost of a functioning world preserved in airless cold. Elsewhere, gravity had failed. Entire districts had lifted free of the surface and hung suspended. Towers hovered meters above their foundations. Ice fields broke into floating masses. Soil and root networks peeled up and drifted in shapeless clouds. The effect was patchy and irregular, like floor tiles pulled at random from a mosaic, leaving the surrounding tiles intact and exposing the emptiness beneath. The gravity failures mapped to the preservation fields, I said, checking the scanner. Where the local microfields are still active, the surface holds. Where they've died, everything lifts. Preservation, Doug said. That's what the readings suggest. Localized gravitational fields maintaining objects in place. Active fields hold things down and correct drift. Dead zones let everything go. Ray was already scanning the nearest city block with his spectrometer, the instrument pressed against the gallery rail, readings scrolling across his wrist display. The alloy composition on those towers is extraordinary. I'm reading a crystalline metal matrix I've never seen in the literature. Tom, if I can get a direct sample from one of those structures. Stay on the gallery, Doug said. Nobody goes down to the surface until Tom maps the active zones. I began mapping. The scanner showed a dense web of microfields covering the habitat surface below us, strongest around intact objects and structures, weakest in open spaces and damaged areas. The pattern matched what I'd begun to suspect, an automated system maintaining gravitational pressure around everything it considered worth holding in place. The active zones were exactly where the best artifacts were. The dead zones held broken ground and empty space. Paul set a vibrating cutting tool against a bulkhead seal near the gallery to open an access panel. He wanted a shortcut to a lower level. The tool engaged against the alien alloy and cut for 3 seconds. Then it came apart in his hands. Paul held the two halves and stared at them. The tool had separated along a plane so smooth the cross-section gleamed under his headlamp, internal wiring and motor components exposed in perfect anatomical detail. I scanned the cut surface. Molecular level smoothness, same signature as the rubble field and corridor displacement. I aimed the scanner at the air around the tool's location and caught the tag end of a gravitational transient, a microfield spike that had activated at the cut point and was already fading. The cutting mechanism is responsive, I said. The tool's vibration triggered a localized gravitational shear. The system reacted to the disturbance and corrected it. Corrected it, Paul said, looking at his ruined cutter. Neutralized the vibration source by separating it along a shear plane. Active fields don't just hold objects in place, they enforce the position they're holding. Doug absorbed this in 2 seconds. New protocol. Passive observation only. Hand-carried samples from confirmed dead zones. Nobody touches anything in an active field. Paul, switch to manual kit. Paul packed the powered tools away and pulled out hand implements. Chisels, collection jars, scraping blades, tweezers. Ray looked at the access panel Paul had tried to open. The bulkhead seal behind it was scored with a hairline mark where the shear had continued through the tool and into the metal beneath. The system had cut the disturbance and everything connected to it. I logged the event and forced my breathing to stay even. 1 unmodeled effect was an anomaly. 2 was a rule. I had just watched the second rule write itself across Paul's cutter. We continued along the gallery toward a ramp that led down to the habitat surface. Below us, the preserved districts waited. Alien towers, frozen plazas, corridors full of artifacts and bodies and machines, every one of them wrapped in gravitational fields that would cut anything that disturbed them. Doug was still pushing toward the highest density zones because the contract demanded proof. Sam Palisade, the extraction firm's founder, was sitting in a boardroom 15 light hours away waiting for patent-grade material. Doug's job was to bring that material back. My job was to keep the team alive while he tried. Ray moved down the ramp ahead of us, sample kit swinging against his hip, spectrometer in hand, headlamp cutting a bright wedge through the dark. He was already scanning the walls of the ramp corridor, where artifacts lined both sides in dense rows, mounted objects, display cases, what looked like engraved panels. Each one sat inside a gravitational microfield I could read on my scanner, small and stable, calibrated to the mass and shape of the object it held. "Exhibition pieces," Ray said, his voice carrying the focused excitement of seeing something impossible for the first time. "This whole corridor is a display. The preservation fields are individual. Each object has its own gravitational cradle. Tom, the field density here is high," I said. "Stay in the center of the corridor. The active fields are concentrated around the wall-mounted objects. The floor reads low activity. Keep your arms in." Ray kept moving. He stopped at an alcove where a series of small objects sat on a structural ledge, carved and intricate, made of the same crystalline alloy as the towers. Overlapping microfields held them in perfect arrangement. Near the edge of the ledge, outside the brightest part of the field return, A sliver of alloy had broken free, loose, maybe dead, maybe accessible. Ray leaned close. His spectrometer hovered centimeters from it. The grain structure on this is… Ray, I said, do not collect from that alcove. It's outside the cradle. His voice had gone soft with concentration. The loose flake is outside the cradle. The field overlaps. Back off. He should have backed off. He was trained. He was tethered. He knew the protocol. But he had spent his entire adult life studying alien matter through contaminated fragments and remote imaging, and inches from his glove was a clean sample of the most advanced construction material ever found, apparently free of its cradle, and sitting on the dead side of a boundary my scanner was still resolving. His tweezers extended. The metal tip touched the loose flake and nudged it by less than a millimeter. My scanner spiked. The gravitational reading around the alcove jumped from maintenance levels to active correction. Ray, pull! He pulled his hand back. He turned toward me. He said something about the sample composition, a partial sentence in the same professional tone he'd used for the last hour. He took a step in my direction. His headlamp projected at a wrong angle, slightly canted, maybe 2 degrees off the axis where his helmet sat on his shoulders. The shadow his torso cast against the corridor wall carried a thin, dark line across it, a horizontal stripe of deeper black running from one edge of his silhouette to the other. I looked at the scanner. The gravitational reading around Ray's body was a complex interference pattern, dozens of microfields, layered, intersecting at intervals of fractions of a millimeter. Each one paper-thin, each one running in a horizontal plane through the space his body occupied. Ray, my voice came out wrong. Stand still. Ray raised his hand to touch his chest, a reflexive gesture. Maybe he felt something. Maybe he felt a strange lightness, a looseness he couldn't name. His glove met the fabric of his suit and passed through it. The suit material separated along a horizontal plane at his sternum, the two halves parting without resistance, the edges bright under his headlamp. Inside the opening, I could see what the fields had already done. Ray's body had been divided into horizontal layers, hundreds of them, each one a fraction of a millimeter thick, still held in approximate position by the microfields around him. Close enough together that his form retained its shape. Close enough that his circulatory system had continued functioning for the seconds it took the shear to complete. He was standing because the layers were stacked. He had been talking because his lungs and larynx and brain had kept working in those first moments of separation, each layer still touching its neighbours, still passing blood and electrical signals across gaps that had begun too small to interrupt them. The gaps widened. Ray looked at his open suit. He looked at what was inside. His face, visible through the helmet visor, carried confusion and something slower than fear, something that had not caught up yet. He tried to speak again, and his mouth moved, but the layers of his jaw and tongue and throat were drifting apart by a millimeter now. The sounds that came out were wet, broken by tiny silences where air passed through gaps that should not exist. The fields fluctuated. The layers began to drift. His face separated. A millimeter of space appeared between each plane, forehead, eyes, cheekbones, jaw, each sliding free of its neighbour with the gentle, unhurried drift of something held together by tension, and now simply relaxing. His expression remained readable across the first 6 or 7 layers. His eyes were still open in the layer that held them. Brow and cheekbone floated above and below, fanning outward in the low gravity, spreading like pages. Doug's command cut through comms, hard and immediate. Fall back. Transit corridor. Move. Paul grabbed my arm and pulled. I was staring at the scanner, watching the field equations describe in precise gravitational notation what was happening to Ray's thoracic cavity, his pelvic girdle, his femurs, his hands, all of it separating into thousands of leaves thinner than paper and drifting apart in the corridor's quarter-gravity. The fields were maintaining each layer individually, holding the pieces in place, preserving them. Paul pulled harder. I moved. We ran back up the ramp. Doug ahead, Paul and me behind, the tether between our pairs snapping taut as we scrambled through the gallery and into the transit corridor. Behind us, in the display corridor, Ray Moffat's body was becoming part of the archive. We stopped in a dead zone 200 meters from the gallery, a corridor section where the gravitational fields had failed entirely. I confirmed it on the scanner, sweeping every surface, checking and rechecking because the image of those horizontal planes was still running in my head, and I needed the numbers to be 0 before I would believe any space was safe. Doug was on comms to Carl. "One casualty, Moffat. We are falling back to assess." Carl's voice came back from the Harlan, steady and professional. "Copy. Updated orbital window. 7 hours 12 minutes to mandatory departure. Do you need extraction?" "Stand by." Doug looked at me. His face behind the visor was composed, cold, operating on a frequency where grief would be processed later, somewhere private, if there was a later. "Brennan, tell me what happened." I told him about the preservation fields and their response to disruption. I told him the shear mechanism treated physical interference as a disturbance to be corrected, an impersonal variable introduced into a calibrated system. The system didn't know Ray was alive. It treated his body the same way it would treat a vibrating tool or a shifting piece of rubble, something that had disrupted a local gravitational equation. Ray had moved an artifact fragment by a fraction of a millimeter. The system corrected. The correction passed through everything in the affected zone, and Ray was standing in the affected zone. "So there's no trigger to avoid," Doug said. "The trigger is presence inside an active field. Mass, vibration, thermal output, displacement, anything the system reads as a variable, changing without permission. Active fields correct. Residual fields can score or displace, but they don't have enough charge to enforce a full correction. Dead zones are safe only as long as they stay dead." I pointed at the corridor around us. "Here, where there's nothing left to preserve." Paul leaned against the corridor wall. His cutting rig sat useless on his back. "Then we document from dead zones. Image capture, long-range spectral scans, enough to satisfy the contract's minimum clause, and we leave." Doug looked at the corridor floor. He was calculating contracts, costs, the institutional math of a mission that had already lost a man and hadn't collected a single patentable sample. Palisade Extraction had spent 14 months and significant capital positioning this recovery. Doug's career, his crew's bonuses, the company's next 3 board presentations, all of it was sitting in those preserved corridors, wrapped in fields that would cut a human body into anatomical cross-sections for the crime of breathing too close. And my name was on the document that said standard precautions would be enough. "We stay in dead zones," Doug said finally. "We document everything we can reach from safe distance. We do not enter active preservation zones under any circumstances. Tom, map field boundaries continuously. If a dead zone starts showing activity, we pull back immediately." "Understood. We have 6 hours and change. Let's use them." Paul pushed off the wall and began repacking his kit for passive survey work. I adjusted the scanner to continuous boundary mapping mode. Doug turned and led us back toward the gallery, where the view over the habitat drum would give us imaging angles on the preserved city districts below. I did not look down the ramp toward the display corridor where Ray's body was drifting apart in its own private gravitational exhibit. The scanner showed the fields in that corridor as active, stable, and maintaining. The system had already incorporated him. Whatever was left of Ray Moffat was being held by the same force that had preserved this civilization's dead for longer than human beings had possessed written language. It would go on holding him with the same impersonal precision until the fields failed, the arc broke apart, and everything inside scattered into orbital rubble. I followed Doug through the dead corridor with the scanner pressed against my chest, the numbers scrolling and the mission clock grinding down. I kept my mind away from the fact that my report had named this survivable. Thinking about that would mean stopping, and stopping was a luxury that belonged to men who had not just watched a colleague die standing up. We spent the next 90 minutes working the gallery and the dead zone corridors that branched off it, collecting long-range spectral data and imaging the preserved districts from every angle the dead zones allowed. Doug was disciplined about the protocol. We crossed no field boundaries. We reached for nothing. We activated nothing powered. Paul ran a handheld camera on a stabilized mount, capturing high-resolution stills of city blocks, canal junctions, tower clusters, and the suspended alien bodies visible on platforms and in open plazas below. I kept the scanner aimed at the field boundaries and watched for drift. The boundaries were drifting. Slowly at the margins, but measurably. Dead zones were losing ground. Active preservation fields crept outward into corridors that had been inert an hour ago. The system was compensating for the cascade damage Ray's death had triggered. When that local field collapsed and reformed around his body, the correction sent a pressure wave through adjacent fields, and those fields were still settling. Each micro-adjustment pushed the active boundary a few centimeters farther into territory I'd marked as safe. I told Doug. He checked his mission clock and calculated how much documentation time we had before the gallery itself became active. 2 hours, he said. Maybe less. Less if another boundary shifts. Then we need a better angle. Paul found it. A maintenance shaft in the floor of a dead zone corridor, 20 meters from the gallery. The shaft dropped vertically through 3 structural levels, and the scanner showed it as fully inert, dead all the way down. At the bottom, a horizontal corridor connected to what appeared to be an observation gallery on a lower level, overlooking something large. I scanned the space below the lower gallery and stopped breathing when the readings resolved. The gravitational signature beneath us was enormous, dense, complex, layered. Thousands of individual microfields interlocked in a 3-dimensional architecture far more sophisticated than anything in the corridors above. The reading covered a space hundreds of meters across and at least 50 meters deep. Whatever the system was preserving down there, it was preserving with everything it had. "There's a major vault below us," I said. "Massive field density. This is the core of the preservation system. Everything above is secondary." Doug looked at the shaft. "Can we observe from the lower gallery without entering the active zone?" I checked the boundary. The lower gallery read as dead space, a narrow margin of inert corridor at the edge of the vault's field structure. The boundary was sharp and, for the moment, stable. "The gallery is outside the active zone, barely. If we stay on the gallery and keep our distance from the vault edge, we should be safe to observe and scan." "Should be," Paul said. I looked at the scanner. The numbers held. "The boundary is stable, the gallery reads clean. I'll monitor continuously." Doug decided in 3 seconds. We descended through the maintenance shaft. Paul first, then Doug, then me, using hand-over-hand grips on the structural ribbing. The shaft was dark, tight, and cold. Our headlamps threw hard circles on alloy walls showing the same separation lines as everything else in the arc. Gravitational displacement, old and inactive. The scars of a system that had once maintained every square centimeter of this structure and had long since retreated to protect what mattered most. We emerged on the lower gallery and looked into the vault. I have spent my career assessing alien structures. I have surveyed ruins on 4 moons, a derelict seed ship in the Tau Ceti rubble belt, and the subterranean machine complex on Bremner's world that took 2 years and 11 survey teams to map. Nothing prepared me for the vault beneath the arc. The chamber was roughly 400 meters across and shaped like the interior of an egg, its walls curving upward and inward to meet at a point high above. Every cubic meter of that space was occupied. Alien bodies floated in gravitational stasis, hundreds of them positioned in poses that suggested interrupted daily life. Seated figures at what might have been workstations. Walking figures frozen mid-stride, legs apart, arms swinging, heads turned toward companions who floated beside them in matching arrest. Groups arranged around tables, around machines, around objects I couldn't classify. Each body was held by its own microfield, suspended in spatial relationship to the bodies and objects around it. The precision of the arrangement was absolute. Every object held position. Every surface appeared molecularly intact. The bodies looked freshly dead, though substrate dating on the chamber walls put the vault millions of years older than the first human cities. Between and around the bodies, machines floated. Vehicles, architectural fragments, walls, doorways, sections of floor with furnishings still attached, transplanted whole from the habitat surface above and preserved as complete environmental tableau. Art objects, written records, flat panels covered in dense angular script, held in reading positions near the hands of the bodies they'd belonged to. Tools, containers, personal effects. The entire vault was a three-dimensional museum organized by gravity alone, each object a variable in an equation spanning the full volume of the chamber. "Tom," Doug said. His voice had changed. The professional command tone was still there, but underneath it was recognition, scale, value, the weight of what we were looking at. "What is this?" "A funerary archive." The words came from the part of my training that classified alien sites. The entire megastructure is a tomb. The habitat drum, the cities, the canals, the display corridors, all of it was built or repurposed to house the dead. This vault is the core. The preservation system exists to maintain this space. Everything we've encountered, the shear fields, responsive corrections, rubble cuts, those are secondary effects of a system whose primary function is keeping this vault intact. "The defense system is incidental," Paul said. "There is no defense system. The shear response is what happens when the preservation math gets disrupted. The system corrects disturbances to protect the archive. Ray died because it treated him the same way it would treat a temperature fluctuation or structural vibration, something to be neutralized so the equation balances." Doug stared into the vault. I watched him process the information the way he processed everything. Intake, assessment, decision. But the decision came slower this time. What floated in that vault was the single most significant Xeno archeological discovery in human history. Every body, every machine, every written panel, every tool and container and architectural fragment represented data that could reshape entire fields of study. The company would build a decade of patents and publications on this find. Governments would bid for access. Universities would name buildings after whoever brought back the proof, and none of it could be touched. I ran field analysis from the gallery rail. The gravitational architecture was extraordinary. Thousands of interlocking microfields, each calibrated to the mass and density of the object it held. I could read the equations on my scanner. Each field was a function of the fields around it, and each object's position was a variable the surrounding fields depended on for their own calibration. Moving one object would force every adjacent field to recalculate. Recalculation meant correction. Correction meant shear. "The entire vault is a single interdependent equation," I told Doug. "Every object's position is load-bearing in the gravitational sense. Disturb one variable and the system has to recalculate the surrounding fields to compensate. In a field this dense, the cascade would propagate." Doug nodded. He understood. I could see him understanding. Then his gaze moved along the gallery rail to where the vault's field boundary met the dead zone. A small object rested on a structural ledge where the gallery rail connected to the vault wall. Carved crystalline alloy, similar to the display corridor artifacts. It sat at the exact boundary between the dead zone and the active field, half in, half out, close enough to reach from where Doug stood. "Doug," I said. He did not answer, his helmet light fixed on the object. "Doug, don't." "We have images," he said quietly. "Images get challenged. Images get buried. Ray died, and we don't have a single physical proof of what killed him. The proof is the data. Palisade will call it corrupted telemetry if they have to. The insurers will call it operator error. That object is half outside the boundary. It is part of the equation." His glove was already moving. "Doug!" His hand crossed the boundary by centimeters, his fingers closed around the object. My voice broke sharp over comms. The scanner readings spiked into a range I'd never seen, a wall of gravitational data flooding the display as the microfield around that single small artifact recalculated. Doug pulled back. The object moved in his grip by millimeters. 2, maybe 3. He released it immediately, and it sat on the ledge at its new position, displaced from its original seat by a distance I could have covered with my thumbnail. The vault began to move. The microfield around the artifact rippled outward into the adjacent fields. The nearest object, a panel of angular script held in reading position near an alien body, shifted by a fraction of a degree. That shift triggered its own field to recalculate, pushing against the field holding the alien body, which pushed against the field holding the workstation the body was seated at, which pushed against the 12 objects in its immediate vicinity. Each began its own correction cycle. The cascade moved through the vault at the speed of gravitational propagation. I watched it on the scanner, a wavefront expanding outward from Doug's contact point, each correction triggering 3 or 4 further corrections, the math compounding exponentially. Objects deep in the vault began to shift. Bodies rotated in place by fractions of a degree. Machines drifted from their positions. The calibrated spatial relationships that had held for eons were unraveling, and each unraveling produced more unraveling. "Back away from the rail," I said. "Doug, move back now." Doug stepped back. A field correction caught his right arm at the sleeve, a shear line thin enough to be invisible separating the outer layer of his suit from wrist to elbow. The material peeled away like dead skin. Underneath, a line of blood appeared on his forearm where the shear had scored the flesh. He pulled back harder. A second correction caught his left leg below the knee. This one was stronger, closer to the vault floor where the boundary was sharpest. The shear clamped his suit against the gallery rail with gravitational pressure, and Doug's forward momentum stopped dead. He was pinned, right arm bleeding, left leg locked against the rail by a field pressing inward with the steady, impersonal force of an equation correcting itself. His suit alarm triggered. Breach at the forearm, breach at the left calf, atmosphere loss in progress. "Paul, get him free," I said, already knowing the answer. Paul took one step toward Doug and the scanner in my hands screamed. The active field boundary was expanding. The cascade in the vault was feeding energy into the boundary fields, and the dead zone was shrinking. The margin of safe space between us and the vault was closing in real time. The gallery was becoming active. Paul stopped. He looked at me. He looked at the scanner display. He understood the numbers. "We have to fall back," I said. Doug, pinned at the rail, suit sealing around the scored arm, leg held by gravitational pressure he couldn't oppose with muscle, looked at us. "Go," he said. "Get above the cascade. I'll manage my air and wait." Paul and I retreated up the maintenance shaft. Behind us, the vault's cascade continued, a spreading wave of gravitational recalculation now visible to the naked eye. Through the gallery opening, I could see bodies drifting from their millennial positions, machines rotating, written panels tumbling in slow arcs as their holding fields collapsed and reformed and collapsed again. The dead civilization's archive was tearing itself apart in perfect, gravitational silence. Every object that moved made 3 more objects move. The system kept trying to correct all of it at once, and the corrections kept failing, and the failures kept cascading. We reached the dead zone corridor above the shaft. I pressed the scanner against every wall and checked every reading. The corridor was still inert. The cascade was propagating downward and outward through the vault, spending most of its energy in the dense field architecture below, and the upper levels had not been reached yet. We had time. How much depended on variables I couldn't model because I had never seen a preservation system in cascading failure. Carl's voice came through on comms. "Boarding team, updated orbital data. The Ark's mass distribution is shifting. I'm reading changes in rotational moment that don't match my decay model. Something structural is moving inside. The launch window has contracted. You have approximately 90 minutes before the docking point shifts beyond recovery alignment. After that, I can hold the Harlan for emergency undock, but your approach angles are gone. 90 minutes. I checked Doug's position on the scanner. He was alive. His suit transponder was broadcasting, and his comms were open. His voice came through steady, clipped with pain but functional. Suit breech is sealed at the arm. Leg is pinned but intact. Pressure holding me against the rail. No shear through tissue. Atmospheric loss is slow. I estimate 65 to 70 minutes of breathable air at current leak rate. Doug, we're working on a route back to you, I said. Paul turned to me in the corridor. His face behind the visor carried something I recognized from 20 years of working with EVA professionals, the expression of running calculations he already knew the answer to. We go back to the Harlan, Paul said. We undock, we leave. Doug would give the same order. Doug didn't give that order. He's pinned to a rail and leaking air because he touched the one thing you told him not to touch. He is not in command of the facts anymore. Ray is dead because we pushed into an active zone. Doug is trapped because he pushed into an active zone. If you go down that shaft into an expanding field, you're doing it again. What do you think happens this time? I was already scanning for alternate routes. The maintenance shaft we'd used was compromised. The cascade was feeding energy into the surrounding fields, and the shaft showed the first traces of gravitational activity at its lower end. Going back down would put me into an active zone before I reached the gallery, but the scanner showed the structure's layout in cross-section, and I could trace alternative paths through the dead zone network. One route existed, a secondary maintenance corridor looping around the vault on the opposite side, approaching the gallery from the far end. It ran through a section of the arc where the preservation system had failed years or decades ago. The route was longer, tighter, and structurally degraded, but it reached the gallery from a direction the cascade hadn't touched yet. 40 minutes to traverse. 10 to extract Doug, assuming the field holding him could be disrupted. That left 40 minutes to get back to the Harlan, through a structure that was actively degrading. The numbers were survivable. Barely. Paul saw me mapping the route. You're trusting the same models that said this place was safe to board. That landed. It was supposed to. My assessment had treated the arc as damaged architecture. It was an active equation with ruins attached. 75 minutes, I said. If Doug and I aren't at the docking breach in 75 minutes, you and Carl leave. Paul looked at me for another few seconds. Then he checked his tether, turned, and started back toward the transit corridor and the docking breach. He didn't argue further or wish me luck. He moved like a man who had made his assessment and accepted the outcome, whatever it turned out to be. I watched him go. Then I turned toward the secondary maintenance corridor and started walking. The corridor was tight, dark, and falling apart. Gravitational damage from old preservation failures had displaced the walls in long, warped curves, opening gaps between structural panels where I could see into the spaces beyond. Empty equipment bays, severed conduit runs, lightless vertical shafts dropping into nothing. I moved by headlamp and scanner, checking every meter of space ahead for field activity. The readings held at 0. This section was dead. But dead was relative. My body had mass. My boots made contact with the floor. My suit radiated thermal energy. In active zones, those inputs would trigger shear corrections. Here, where the system had already failed, my passage woke only residual traces. Ghost fields too weak to enforce a full correction, but strong enough to remember the motion they had once opposed. Small objects around me reacted to those traces. A length of conduit wire separated into 3 clean segments as I passed, the pieces drifting apart in the microgravity. A wall panel developed a hairline split from top to bottom, the 2 halves shifting by a centimeter. Dust, or what served as dust in an alien structure, fine particulate from millennia of molecular-level surface degradation, sliced into finer particulate as the ghost fields acted on it. My suit took 2 scores along the left arm. Surface cuts in the outer layer, nowhere near deep enough to breach. I catalogued them, tracked the field readings at each event, and kept moving. The numbers were small. The risk was tolerable. The corridor was holding. I emerged on the far side of the gallery after 38 minutes. The vault was below me, and the view from this angle showed the cascade's progress. Roughly a third of the vault had collapsed. The section nearest Doug's contact point had lost coherence. Bodies, objects, and machines had drifted from their positions, some still held by weakened fields in wrong orientations. Others separated into familiar layered cross-sections as overcorrecting fields applied shear forces to objects they could no longer calibrate. Alien faces fanned open into horizontal leaves. Workstations came apart into component layers. Written panels dissolved into drifting sheets of alloy thinner than foil. The angular script still visible on each separate lamina, still legible, still carrying whatever message had been important enough to bury with the dead. The remaining two-thirds of the vault was intact. The cascade front marked the boundary where ordered stasis met expanding chaos. The system was fighting. I could see it in the scanner data. Intact fields strengthening at the cascade boundary, trying to firewall the damage. The effort drew power from the outer sections of the arc, which explained Carl's readings about shifting mass distribution. The preservation system was cannibalizing the megastructure's margins to protect the vault's core. Doug was still at the gallery rail. His suit transponder put him 17 meters from my position. The gallery between us was partly in the dead zone, partly in the expanded active field. I scanned the boundary. The active zone reached approximately 4 meters from the rail where Doug was pinned. The remaining 13 meters between me and that boundary were inert. "Doug, I'm on the far side of the gallery. I'm going to cross to you." "Tom." His voice was thinner. The air loss was accumulating. "The field around my leg has been fluctuating, getting stronger for a few seconds, then easing off. It's following the cascade rhythm." I studied the readings. He was right. The field pinning his leg was cycling, surging when the cascade front hit a dense cluster of objects below and the system compensated, easing when the front passed into emptier space. The surges lasted 2 to 4 seconds. The lulls lasted 6 to 8. During a lull, the field strength dropped to roughly 60% of its peak. Still enough to hold him. Maybe not enough if something changed the local mass distribution. I covered the 13 meters of dead gallery at a careful walk. At the boundary, I stopped. 4 meters of active field between me and Doug. The scanner showed the field's response latency. The delay between a disturbance entering the zone and the system applying correction. I needed data. I picked up a piece of structural rubble from the gallery floor, a rod of alien alloy about a meter long, and pushed it into the active field with my arm extended. The rod was sliced after 1.5 seconds, the separated piece drifting away. 1.5 seconds of latency. I could cross 4 meters in under a second if I moved fast. The correction cycle would begin when I entered the field, but the shear would apply after the delay. If I reached Doug before the window closed, the correction would hit empty space behind me. If I was slow, or if the latency was shorter than my single data point suggested, it would hit me. "I'm crossing on the next lull," I said. "When I reach you, I need to change the mass distribution around your leg. I'm going to push your equipment pack into the field on the opposite side. The system should shift to account for the new mass. When the pressure drops, you pull free. That feeds the cascade." "Yes." The word sat there between us. The scanner filled my visor with proof. Every new variable made the equation worse. I could save Doug by damaging the archive further, or preserve the archive by leaving him pinned to it until his air ran out. Doug's breathing came through the comms, thin and controlled. "Do it," he said. I watched the scanner. The cascade surged through a cluster of preserved vehicles below us, and the field at the boundary spiked. Then the front moved past, and the readings dropped. I pushed off the gallery floor and crossed. The 4 meters took less than a second. The field scored my suit along the left hip, and the outer layer separated in a clean line from waist to knee, the material flapping free. Underneath, my thermal layer was intact. I grabbed the gallery rail beside Doug and braced. Doug's face was grey behind the visor. His arm had stopped bleeding. The suit's medical layer had sealed the score. His leg was pressed against the rail at a bad angle, the gravitational pressure bending his knee sideways. His air readout showed 22 minutes of reserve. I unclipped his equipment pack from his harness. 8 kilograms of sampling gear, camera equipment, and emergency supplies. I swung it over the rail and shoved it into the active field on the vault side, releasing it into the space below the gallery where the field density was highest. The pack entered the field. The system registered the new mass. I saw it on the scanner, local equations shifting, the field around Doug's leg recalculating to incorporate a new variable. For 2 seconds, the pressure on his leg dropped as the system redistributed. Doug wrenched his leg free from the rail and I pulled him backward. We stumbled across the 4-meter active zone toward the dead gallery. The correction hit the space we'd vacated. The gallery rail where Doug had been pinned separated into 3 horizontal sections, the cuts appearing simultaneously along its full length. The pieces drifted apart in the way I'd seen in Ray's body and in the vault's collapsing archive. 2 seconds slower, and those cuts would have passed through us. We were on the dead side of the gallery. Doug's leg was damaged, suit breached at the calf, knee swollen and refusing to bend fully, but the bone was intact, and the limb was whole. He leaned on me, and we moved. Behind us, the equipment pack I'd thrown into the vault was already gone. The fields had corrected for it, and the correction had sent new energy into the cascade. The front accelerated. I could hear it now, a low structural groan transmitted through the gallery floor as the vault's fields pulled power from the surrounding architecture, and the surrounding architecture protested. Below, the remaining intact sections of the archive were losing coherence faster than the system could compensate. Bodies preserved for eons separated into layered cross-sections, each layer fanning open with the slow grace of something that had been holding itself together by mathematical will and had finally run out of numbers. Machines unfolded into component sheets. The angular script on the written panels peeled apart letter by letter, each character becoming a stack of alloy leaves thinner than wavelengths of light, still carrying the shapes of an alphabet no human had ever read, and now never would. I did not watch it happen. I had the scanner and Doug's weight on my shoulder and the route back to the maintenance shaft. We moved. The dead zones held. The cascade spent itself downward into the vault and outward into the ark's margins, and the upper corridors stayed inert long enough for us to climb the maintenance shaft and reach the transit corridor. "Carl, 2 coming to the docking breach. Doug is injured, mobile with assistance. Give me a time." 14 minutes to mandatory undock. Paul is aboard and we're prepped for emergency departure. Move, Tom. We moved. Doug limped on his damaged leg while I kept the scanner aimed ahead. The transit corridor was the same displaced, separated architecture we'd walked through hours ago, each bulkhead standing open in its gravitational offset, each section of wall and conduit and floor panel holding its position in the fanned-out diagram of a hallway that an alien preservation system had gently pulled apart and maintained in ruin for longer than I could calculate. The docking breach was ahead. I could see Paul's headlamp through the gap, the Harlan's hull beyond. Doug grabbed the breach edge and hauled himself through. Paul caught him on the other side and guided him toward the airlock. I crossed last. As I pulled my boots from the ark's structural rib, I felt the rib shift under me. A lateral displacement of centimeters, clean and smooth. The gravitational correction passing through the docking structure as the cascade finally reached the outer ring. The clamps released. Carl fired the departure burn before the airlock was fully sealed, and the Harlan pulled away from the ark on the remaining launch window with less margin than I wanted to calculate. I went to the observation port as the distance opened. The ark was shedding. Entire city blocks were separating from the habitat drum's inner surface. Towers, plazas, canal sections, frozen forests, each one sliding apart from its neighbours along clean gravitational planes. The displacement was architectural, orderly, and vast. The sections didn't tumble. They didn't shatter. They separated into layered components and drifted outward in slow formation, each piece maintaining its internal structure while the bonds between pieces dissolved. The preservation system was performing triage, amputating contaminated sections to protect whatever remained intact in the vault's core. The cuts were precise. The sections were clean. The operation was exactly what I'd seen in the corridors, in the rubble field, in Ray's body. Matter being politely, precisely persuaded to stop being continuous. The rubble field we'd flown through on approach was thickening as I watched. New wreckage joined the old. Fresh-cut structural plating, tower sections, habitat surface fragments, all of it sliced to the same molecular tolerance as the rubble that had drifted here for centuries. I looked at that older wreckage now and understood what it was. The clean-cut probes, the layered alien bodies, the sliced plating, those hadn't been intruders destroyed by a defense system. They were amputations. The preservation system had been shedding failing sections for millennia, cutting away everything it could no longer maintain, ejecting the surgical waste into orbit to protect the archive inside. The field of wreckage around the Ark was a midden of gravitational triage, every piece in it something the system had decided it could survive without. The vault cascade was changing that calculus. The sections being shed now were larger, more frequent and closer to the core. The system was cutting deeper, losing more to save what remained. My scanner, still running on the data feeds from inside, showed the vault's intact percentage dropping, 50, 42, 37. Within days, the cascade would consume the entire archive. Within weeks, the mass loss from shedding would drop the Ark below stable orbit, and the gas giant's tidal forces would pull the ring apart. The largest intact alien archive in human history would become a cloud of molecularly sliced rubble, indistinguishable from the wreckage already circling it. My assessment had brought us here. My name on the boarding certification had put 4 men inside that structure. Ray Moffat was dead, his body preserved in a corridor display he'd been too eager to sample, held in gravitational stasis by a system that had incorporated him into the collection without malice or awareness. The vault was collapsing because Doug had reached for proof, and because I had rescued him, and because rescue had mass, and mass had consequences. The data on my scanner, the field equations, the structural readings, the images of the vault before it fell, was the only comprehensive record that the archive had existed as a coherent whole. Every research body, every university, every government with a Xeno Archeological program would want this data. It was the proof. It was also the evidence of what we'd done. Doug was in the transit bay behind me, leg immobilized in an emergency splint Paul had rigged from suit components, breathing from a backup supply because his suit atmosphere had thinned to unsafe levels during the extraction. He was alive because I'd gone back for him. He was alive because I'd thrown his equipment pack into a gravitational field that was already failing, and the pack's mass had accelerated a cascade that was now consuming a dead civilization's final monument. Every field equation on my scanner confirmed the math. I could calculate exactly how much destruction my decision had caused, down to the cubic meter per hour. Paul came aft and told me Carl needed help with the departure trajectory. The Ark's mass shedding was changing the local gravity gradient, and the Harlan's plotted course needed correction. I powered down the scanner. The display went dark and the field equations disappeared. The last real-time portrait of the vault's gravitational architecture was committed to storage, where it would sit alongside my boarding assessment, my mission logs, and Ray's final spectrometer readings. Evidence. Legacy. None of it enough. I went forward to help Carl with the numbers. The numbers were something I could do. They had always been enough, in every structure I'd ever surveyed, to keep everyone safe and bring everyone home. That record was broken now, and it would stay broken. The math I carried in my head would spend the rest of my career calculating the exact dimensions of what I had lost and what I had destroyed and what I would choose, given the same data, to destroy again. Through the forward port, the Ark was still visible. A broken ring shedding itself into a thickening cloud of geometric wreckage, each piece catching the light of the distant sun and flashing once before tumbling into the shadow of everything it used to be part of. I sat down at the navigation console and began correcting our course.